I'm Allyson Leacock. I am currently the chairman of the Barbados Broadcasting Authority, and I'm also the director of the National Transformation Initiative, which is an education platform, as it were, headed by led by the government of Barbados, intended to transform our citizens into being cutting edge for the future. In a nutshell, global citizens fit for purpose. I previously, for 12 years, worked with the Caribbean Broadcast Media Partnership on HIV and AIDS. And we had a very successful Caribbean campaign known as Live Up, Love, Protect, Respect. So it is probably wearing that hat that I will speak to you most today.
Could you start, Allyson, with telling us a little about how you use communications principles in this campaign that you're leading now?
Well, I think it's always important to connect. We have a choice to push information out or draw people in. And I certainly believe in drawing people in to A, resonate with them, but B, also to meet people where they are. Because if you're insensitive to their circumstances, then however passionate your message, they won't hear it because of their circumstances. So I'm very mindful of that approach. And a lot of that was heightened with my work in HIV, which, although it was concentrated for 12 years with the Caribbean Broadcast Media Partnership on HIV and AIDS, it really began when I was director of culture. And even before that, as a young green broadcaster, because you go into so many communities and you meet so many people that many of your traditional mindsets are challenged if you are in a sense of living in the real world and ensuring that you have a sense of mindfulness. So I think that those are the fundamentals that underpin everything that I do professionally, if I'm honest.
Can you talk some particularly about how you apply some of these principles around communications and solutions journalism in the areas of stigma and discrimination?
Sure. I think stigma and discrimination are very much rooted in ignorance in the truest sense of the word. It's also rooted in socialization and emotionalism. So it's really important that as a journalist, we try to peel those layers away and help our audiences see the facts, see both sides of the story, and then make an informed decision themselves. Also challenge them. Every time our audiences see a piece we produce, they should say, I get it. Or, ooh, I never knew that. If they don't do that, we have failed them because what we're doing is regurgitating what has been said by somebody else. And it hasn't moved the needle for them. It hasn't moved them along the spectrum of where their thinking is to enlightenment. And I think that that is what we must we must always do. We should always be looking to enlighten our audiences. When it is very well done, um, I think it opens the door for a number of powerful partnerships that will help to build a greater understanding and empathy and compassion, all of those things that we like to consider unimportant, but to my mind are actually not soft skills, success skills that we need more of. And more often than not, I think we have to challenge ourselves to the age-old dictum that if it bleeds, it leads, especially in small island developing states like ours. Why? Because I think that diminishes the need to pivot in a world that is filled with deep-seated prejudices that have been sanctioned by large, powerful forces globally. And moral leadership is in short supply. So when that kind of journalism is poorly done, certainly with regard to stigma and discrimination, the implications, I think, are far reaching. In small nations like ours in the Caribbean, the media cannot be driven only by commercial imperatives, but the media has to be, in my view, mindful of the implications of their record of an event and its implications on a close-knit community, and equally recognize not only their editorial authority, but their social responsibility.
Um, Thank you, Alison. That was really powerful. And I was wondering if you could talk some, though, about the historical imperative to be balanced and get people to feel like they have new knowledge versus the solutions journalism approach, um, where you really want to get people to is to be motivated and knowledgeable to act.
Well, I don't know that I see them as mutually exclusive. I think they really are partners if we are going to take our journalism to the next level. Too often we feel it has to be a choice. And I say that today there are many lines that are blurred in a converged environment where our audiences are also technically reporters in social media. There has to be an appreciation for different styles of delivery without compromising the facts. I think we have to be mindful of the sensitivities and the responses, and also how much things are choreographed by the big guns to almost force us to start thinking that those are the facts, when in truth and in fact, they're really somebody else's narrative that we take up wholesale. So the need to be incisive in your analysis, to do your homework so you know the facts. Because without the facts, you can't challenge something that is very well packaged because it looks so good. So I believe that they have to ensure that you apply your knowledge to the facts that you have, but also the realities that exist. And wherever it is possible, work with experts in the field. So you bring another perspective. What we often do is forget that even in our newsrooms, some of the people who live and experience stigma may be in the newsroom and you just don't know. And therefore, there has to be this inclusion of experts where you begin to see another perspective rather than only your own, or rather than only what the textbook tells you, but to begin to be like a sponge, that you absorb the multiple triggers as well as the multiple um, cues and sensibilities that are around you, so that you recognize what is relevant within your cultural context that can't be ignored if people are going to interpret your communication, because it has to be a two-way street. And we have to remember not to exclude our audiences. So in our media training, we always included experts who worked with affected populations, not just those who are infected, but those who are affected, who live with the stigma and discrimination, and also, wherever possible, allow those persons affected to tell their story. But somebody could argue there are always three sides to a story: mine, yours, and the truth. And in the case of our Live Up campaign, this approach to our training for media professionals included not only people living with HIV, but also members of the LGBTQ community, because there were so many effects on everything. And we've had some very positive responses to that approach.
Can you tell us how to avoid being part of someone else's choreography? That was a wonderful term that you used to describe the kind of messaging journalists and communicators sometimes get given.
I believe, again, it really does have to be about empowering ourselves, loaded with information from multiple perspectives. I think we are very tempted to gravitate to how things are packaged. And I venture to challenge our journalists to look beneath that. The stardom factor, the celebrity factor, those are elements with which we live every day and have become increasingly almost more prevalent than the facts. Well, there are no alternative facts. There may be alternative perspectives, but they're not necessarily the facts. So it is incumbent on us as a fourth estate to always look for the facts. And once we have the facts, perhaps even with alternative perspectives, share how those perspectives can inject the facts with a color that changes the facts, with a color or a nuance that perhaps we hadn't thought of, because the audience must be able to extrapolate from your story what the real story is. They do make decisions for themselves once you present that balanced story. And one of the things that we have to guard against is reinforcing some of that stigma by the kind of story we create. So are we going to lean towards the heavy, scary, fearful message that is really attractive if it is salacious or sensational? Are we going to make the stigma itself a villain and demonize the people who are victims of it? Or are we going to bring them another perspective? Are we going to make judgments? Because that's not our job. Are we going to exclude the person from the story? Are we going to be inserting ourselves and being preachy or being advocacy oriented or too statistic heavy? These are things to avoid because unwittingly they reinforce the stigma you're trying to change.
Wonderful, thank you. Is there anything else that you'd like to add?
I think I'd like to add that communication challenges exist in communicating stories about stigma. Um, People might be aware of the stigma, but they don't act on what they know. They don't see themselves at risk of the same treatment for stigma or discrimination. Um, they have their own social associations with certain stigma, and therefore it is incumbent on us to ensure that we are sharing another perspective to help people pause. So when we position an HIV, for example, along with other social and health issues confronting the Caribbean, um, people may be jaded. COVID has shown that. There are a lot of similarities between the responses to COVID and the initial responses to HIV. What HIV had was that layer of sexual encounter, which for many people in the Caribbean remains taboo to talk about overtly. And so we have to be mindful that our audiences are also very jaded. They're tired. And there are a number of common misconceptions that A, it can't happen to me, or B, it only happens to other people. And final message, if I had one really, our role has to be beyond being a star, which is what um, the visual component has engendered, or even moving beyond covering a minister. Um, when you are at the top of your game as a broadcaster or as a journalist, that's what makes you a how you tell the story, are immersed in the quality of your work, and therefore that adds value. But ultimately, our role is to give voice to the voiceless, to have the difficult conversations that politicians and policymakers cannot, do not, or will not have. We have to move beyond, as I said at the very beginning, pushing information to drawing people in. And the way we do that is to remember that this is always a story that affects a human being. And therefore, I think we have to always, always put people first.
It's a lovely notion to close with. Thank you so much, Allyson.
Thank you.